I grew up in New Jersey, and I think like most kids on the coast, I have had my fair share of experiences with hurricanes. The first big one was definitely Sandy in 2012. Um, I do remember, I guess just that night, everyone was really kind of frazzled and like the supermarket shelves were empty. Um, and I remember my family were all like in one room, and like me and my younger sibling were just like talking about whether or not the tree that like sat outside of our apartment was gonna like hold up with all of the wind. And luckily it did. There was no lasting damage to our like place of residence. And no one in my family was hurt, which is great. But I do remember just the next like day, the next week, walking outside and seeing all of the immediate damage in my neighborhood. Lots of downed trees, lots of downed wires, a lot of people who just didn't have power, and like turning on the news for the next week and seeing just the overall damage in the state, especially around like the immediate beachfront area, and how just really scary that was. And it feels like a lot of the years since then, there has been some sort of major weather event. The severity of the hurricanes has definitely like decreased. And I think the last big one was definitely Ida. I was living in New York at the time, so I was separated from my family. And I remember that night in a lot of detail because I got a call from my younger sibling, and my family didn't know that the hurricane was happening. Uh, I think at the time it had like hit Florida and was coming up the coast, but people underestimated how severe it would be. And my family was all together. They were at my grandparents'. My grandparents lived next to a river, and there was just so much water that they couldn't get out of their house. Uh, Most of the cars in the area had gone up, like gone under. My mom lost her car, and it was I was in New York, so there was a lot of damage on our end, and the storm was pretty severe there. But being separated from my family, I guess I was a bit frazzled, and sort of you don't know what's happening to the people you care about and where they are. So that was really jarring for me. And I think those are some of like the main climate extreme weather events that I've had to face personally. Don't recommend, gotta say. It's when you're going through it, it's not like this is climate change. This is an event that I'm trying to live through. But definitely, and even in the subsequent days um, afterwards, it's sort of just, okay, how do we rebuild from here? And my background is in urban infrastructure, specifically sustainable urban infrastructure. And I think the big thing for me is just having to rebuild constantly, and how we're not really prepared to do that, at least in America. Um, we have a crumbling infrastructure system pretty much across the spectrum. The American Society of Civil Engineers releases an infrastructure report card every single year. The last one was from 2021, and we scored a C, which isn't failing. But if you look at the subsections, like our stormwater management systems, our transit systems, our roads, how we handle our levees, those areas have like a D. And having to rebuild isn't an issue. But when you have your normal, climate and weather systems that are being disrupted constantly at a much higher rate than they've ever been historically, and you don't have the proper infrastructure to handle that, and you can't rebuild at a rate, the rate that you're rebuilding is slower than the rate at which climate change is happening. You have to think of other solutions, and you have to be a bit more aggressive in how you tackle the problem. So I think that's where I come from and where I get into activism. It's the people in power aren't doing what they need to do fast enough to protect the people in my community. And my activism is really just the way that I speak for my community. So when they're suffering, like post extreme weather event, after I've helped them in whatever ways I can, after if I'm affected, after we connect and we talk and we rebuild on our end, then I go after, the politicians who are in charge of making sure that we have the funding for this, that appropriate climate action is taking place at the policy level, because I can't get calls like that every year where I'm away from my family and they are going through an event and they're not sure what's happening. I need to be sure that the rate at which that happens in my life decreases significantly. I think the big takeaway that I want others to have from my story is that action at any level is really appropriate and pretty much a necessity in making sure that you and your community are able to not only survive, but thrive. And for me, a lot of my activism and my drive to just enact justice definitely comes from, older generations and talking to my grandparents. They grew up during the height of the civil rights movement. They were very young. They were from the South, and sort of just hearing what that was like to go through, and just the stories that they have from any social interactions that they had when they were younger, it really impacts how I view social justice across the spectrum. Because a lot of those stories, I remember them, they would sit me down and tell me, well, Barack Obama was campaigning for the first time. My grandmother was like, when I grew up, her and her sister were the only two Black children in school, and they would be confronted with a lot of just misinformation about racial relations, and sort of seeing that juxtaposed with the nomination and election of the first Black president was really eye-opening to how much can change in a really short amount of time. And every time I try to confront these really big issues like climate change, which isn't something that one person or one group can tackle, I sort of just have to remind myself that this isn't any different than anything that's happened before. And while it might feel overwhelming in the moment, the danger of the status quo is that it limits the imagination to everything that's possible. And as climate justice is, another form of social justice, I have a lot of faith in how this is going to go and how this is going to end up, because a lot can change in a generation or even a couple of years. And while we might be in the last very crucial couple of years, I don't want myself or anyone else to face climate fatigue or that overall climate doomerism, excuse me, because of just the limited scope of imagination that's forced on us, when you live in a society that imposes a very specific status quo. If you get anything from my story, I want you to know that a lot's possible, and even in a really short amount of time.